There is perhaps no revolutionary hero so connected to books as Henry Knox. A bookseller before the war, Knox is indelibly associated with the printed word's relationship to military practice, which is ironic considering he had almost no formal education. But the popular image of Knox spending his idle hours pulling books off of his store shelves to read is somewhat misleading. Rather, Knox's education reveals a young man hungry for information who pursued knowledge despite the limitations of his origin and education.
Knox's father died when he was very young, and he was unable to complete grammar school. His eventual trade, however, was bookselling, which exposed him to the literary world. For a decade, he worked in the busy shop of Wharton and Bowes in the heart of Boston. In 1771, Henry Knox became a businessman in his own right at the age of 21, with the opening of his New London bookstore. Knox's store operated until 1775, with the British occupation of the city. But during that time, he sold nearly 800 different titles, including both Scots and English Bibles, in addition to blank books and ledgers, stationery such as paper, ink, penknives, sealing wax and wafers, flutes, fifes, walking sticks, spectacles, and even coffee, sugar, and wine. With all this stock, however, very few were military books. With no regular army in America, there simply wasn't the demand for such volumes, at least outside basic training for the militia. Knox did stock 7 volumes of John Muller's works on mathematics, fortifications, artillery, and related topics. Written by the master instructor of Britain's Royal Military Academy, these were the most accessible English sources on these topics. In addition, he carried a translation of military instructions to young officers by the King of Prussia, a medical book called Pringle's Diseases of the Army, and finally, the Plan of the Discipline of the Norfolk Militia, which was the authorized drill for the colony's militia until late 1774.
That was the extent of his military offerings, hardly an exhaustive course in military science. But as the Revolutionary War began in 1775, Americans were hungry for books to help them meet the growing crisis. John Adams was keenly aware of this, and he wrote to a friend in the Continental Army and to Henry Knox, whose career he had helped foster, seeking recommendations.
The small matter of transporting 60 tons of artillery from Ticonderoga delayed his response, but after returning to the American camp, Knox apologized for the delay and presented Adams with a detailed list of works that could transform the amateur American soldiers into something like professionals. Knox's reading list showed his erudition and the breadth of his reading on military affairs, which went well beyond his own stock, his native tongue, and the typical extent of American military reading. Knox's foremost recommendation to Adams was Marshal Saxe's Reveries, or Memoirs Concerning the Art of War, the product of perhaps the most successful French officer of the century. Translated into English in the 1750s, Saxe's broad-ranging work covered a range of theoretical and practical ways to improve soldiering. Knox was so complimentary that he claimed Saxe, quote, "stalks a god in war." But Knox also suggested practical works, such as the Chevalier de Clarac's Field Engineer, as well as English works, such as John Cleve Plydell's Field Fortifications and Holliday's Practical Gunnery. His recommendations for more detailed works on fortifications and siegecraft, combining both engineering, artillery, and grand strategy, were from eminent French and Dutch authors. Among his recommendations were Count Pagan, Bellador, Blondel, Cohorn, and of course, the inimitable Marshal Vauban, whose work on siege warfare and fortifications was the most influential of the era. The only crossover with the stock of Knox's own store were the works of John Muller, which, Knox acknowledged, were largely culled from these French and Dutch authorities. Knox's recommendations reveal an understanding of military science reflective of the broader Atlantic world, not just a provincial bookseller and his wares. Knox's knowledge was the result of his concerted efforts to find and consume literature on the art of war rather than a byproduct of his business. This took time and effort, especially as he never attended college, even if he had access to Harvard's library, as has been suggested. Knox developed a cosmopolitan military understanding understanding that was informed by books and reading equal to professional soldiers, but not those most commonly consumed by Americans. Knox had already put this knowledge to use as a volunteer, helping lay out fortifications in the American lines outside Boston and earning the notoriety of several influential officers and politicians. At an October conference between Washington and representatives from New England, Knox's name was floated for a commission as Lieutenant Colonel of Engineers. Even without formal military training or higher education, Knox had the confidence in his knowledge to request a full colonelcy in command of the Army's artillery regiment.
For the present, Knox had to be content with the expedition to Ticonderoga. And although he left Cambridge only as Mr. Henry Knox, the day after he received his orders, the Congress in Philadelphia approved his promotion to colonel in the Continental Artillery. In 1779, Philadelphia printers Steiner and Sist acknowledged Knox in the dedication to their reprint of John Muller's Treatise of Artillery, which by then reflected the experience that complemented his reading on the pages of the first book of artillery printed in the United States.